The C-130 Hercules touched down at Pope Army Airfield just after dawn, its wheels screeching against the tarmac as the North Carolina sun broke over the horizon. Staff Sergeant Maya Reeves sat in the webbed seating along the aircraft's hull, her single duffel bag resting between her boots. She'd learned long ago to travel light. Everything she truly needed could fit in that bag, and anything else was just weight that slowed you down. As the rear ramp lowered with a hydraulic whine, Reeves caught her first glimpse of Fort Bragg's Special Operations Training Compound. It looked like every other military installation she'd seen over the past decade. Blocky buildings painted in desert tan, obstacle courses stretching across red clay fields, and the ever-present sound of cadence calls echoing from somewhere beyond the tree line. Nothing about it was welcoming, and that was exactly the point. She stepped onto the tarmac, adjusting the straps on her duffel. At 28, Reeves had the lean, efficient build of someone who'd spent years in the field rather than the gym. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform pressed but not overly so, presentable without drawing attention. Everything about her appearance was calibrated to be forgettable, a skill she'd honed until it became second nature. The reception area was a converted warehouse where candidates from across the special operations community gathered for in-processing. Reeves joined the line, watching the men around her size each other up with the practiced assessment of predators meeting at a watering hole. Most were in their early 20s, their bodies thick with muscle, their voices loud with the confidence of men accustomed to being the best in their units. "Yo, check it out," a voice stage whispered nearby. "They actually sent a female." Reeves didn't react, her expression neutral as she filled out paperwork. She'd expected this, anticipated it even. The whispers continued behind her, speculation about whether she was a pilot, a support specialist, or someone's diversity initiative experiment. None of them considered that she might actually be there to compete. The in-processing NCO, a grizzled staff sergeant with a combat infantry badge and ranger tab, barely glanced at her DD Form 1172 before stamping it and waving her through. "Barracks assignment is on your sheet. Formation at 800 in the main courtyard. Don't be late." The barracks was a two-story concrete structure that had probably been built during the Cold War and hadn't been updated since. Reeves found her assigned bay, an open room with 20 bunks arranged in 2 rows. She was the first to arrive, which suited her perfectly. She chose a bunk in the middle of the room, neither seeking attention by taking a prominent position nor hiding in the corner. Mediocrity was camouflage, and she'd worn it well for years. Over the next hour, the other candidates filtered in. They moved with the swagger of elite operators, Navy SEALs with their cocky grins, Army Rangers with their quiet intensity, Marine Force Recon with their barely contained aggression, and a handful of Air Force pararescue jumpers who carried themselves like they had nothing left to prove. They claimed bunks, established territorial boundaries, and began the ritual of introductions that always involved comparing deployment stories and casualty counts. Reeves unpacked methodically, arranging her gear with military precision but without flourish. She placed her running shoes beneath her bunk, hung her uniforms in her locker, and stacked 3 books on her footlocker: a technical manual on asymmetric warfare, a dog-eared copy of The Art of War, and a novel in Arabic that she read to keep her language skills sharp. "Well, well," a voice boomed across the bay. "Looks like the Army sent us a Girl Scout." Derek Matson stood at the entrance, his SEAL trident gleaming on his chest, his arms crossed in a pose designed to showcase biceps the size of footballs. He was handsome in an obvious way, square jaw, bright teeth, the kind of symmetrical features that probably got him out of trouble his entire life. Several other candidates laughed at his comment, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. Reeves looked up briefly, made eye contact just long enough to acknowledge she'd heard him, then returned to organizing her locker. The dismissal was subtle but deliberate. Matson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Strong, silent type, huh? That's cute. We'll see how long that lasts when the real training starts. Leave her alone, Matson, another voice interjected. Jackson Torres, a compact Latino man with a Ranger scroll and Special Forces tab, dropped his gear on the bunk next to Reeves. He had the watchful eyes of someone who'd spent time in places where letting your guard down got you killed. Everyone's here for the same reason. Let's see how people perform before running our mouths. Matson shrugged, his grin never wavering. Just making conversation, brother, no harm meant. He turned to address the room. Anybody know what her MOS is? Admin? Supply? Please don't tell me they're letting mechanics try out for the unit now. The unit, everyone here knew what that meant, even if no one said it out loud. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, the Army's most secretive and selective special missions unit. The training pipeline they were entering wasn't officially part of Delta selection, but everyone knew it was a feeder program, a way to identify candidates who might have what it took. I'm 18 series, Reeves said quietly, her voice even and unremarkable. Special Forces. The room went silent for a moment. Women weren't barred from Special Forces anymore, but the pipeline was notoriously brutal, with attrition rates over 90%. If she'd actually made it through, it meant something. Matson said, his tone suggesting he didn't quite believe her. Well, congratulations on making it this far. This course is a different beast, though. Hope you're ready. Reeves didn't respond. She closed her locker with a soft click and sat on her bunk, pulling out a notebook and pen. While the other candidates continued their peacocking displays and alpha male bonding rituals, she began writing notes, observations, details about the facility layout and the personalities surrounding her. Information was ammunition, and she was always collecting it. At 800 sharp, the platoon assembled in the courtyard. 30 candidates stood in rough formation, their boots crunching on gravel as they shuffled into position. Master Sergeant Vance Kruger emerged from the headquarters building like a storm front, his face weathered by years in combat zones most people couldn't find on a map. He had the build of a man who'd spent 3 decades carrying heavy loads across hostile terrain, thick shoulders, scarred hands, eyes that missed nothing. Listen up, Kruger's voice carried without him needing to shout. For the next 8 weeks you belong to me. I don't care what unit you came from, what wars you fought in, or how many confirmed kills you have. Here you're all equally worthless until you prove otherwise. This course is designed to break you, to strip away the bullshit and find out what you're really made of. Some of you will quit. Some of you will fail. A few of you might actually make it through. Questions? Silence. Good, we start with baseline assessments. PT test in 30 minutes. After that, obstacle course, then land navigation. Move out. The physical training test was standard: push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and a timed run. Reeves performed adequately on each event, her scores hovering in the middle of the pack. She finished her 2-mile run in 14 minutes and 30 seconds, respectable but not impressive, especially compared to Matson's 12-minute sprint or Tor's sub-13 performance. As the candidates sprawled on the grass afterward, sucking wind and guzzling water, Matson jogged over to where Reeves sat. Hey, not bad he caught himself, for someone who's probably not used to this intensity. Reeves took a long drink from her canteen, her expression unreadable. Thanks. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the candidates gathered in the barracks, Matson organized an informal pool. $20 a head, winner takes all. The bet: how many days until Reeves dropped out? Torres declined to participate, instead settling onto his bunk with a worn paperback. But he watched Reeves from the corner of his eye, noting how she seemed completely unbothered by the speculation surrounding her. There was something about her stillness that reminded him of the snipers he'd worked with downrange, that absolute economy of movement, that sense of someone always observing, always calculating, always 3 steps ahead. As lights out approached and the barracks settled into uneasy sleep, Reeves lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities for her platoon mates to underestimate her. She smiled in the darkness. Let them. The first week at Fort Bragg's Special Operations Training Facility established a brutal rhythm that separated the confident from the truly capable. Reveille at 500, physical training until breakfast, then a rotating cycle of tactical exercises, weapons qualifications, and scenario-based training that pushed candidates to their mental and physical limits. By day 8, 2 candidates had already dropped out, one with a stress fracture, another who simply walked off the obstacle course mid-run and never came back. Maya Reeves maintained her pattern of steady, unremarkable competence. During the obstacle courses, she finished in the middle of the pack, her movements efficient but not flashy. In the shoothouse drills, her marksmanship was solid, consistent center mass hits, adequate time, nothing that drew particular attention. The instructors marked her scores without comment, their clipboards filling with data that painted a picture of someone who was capable enough to stay but not exceptional enough to stand out. It was exactly what she intended. Derek Matson, meanwhile, had appointed himself the platoon's unofficial leader, a role he assumed with the natural ease of someone who'd never been told no. During team exercises, he positioned himself at the center of every planning session, his voice the loudest in every debrief. The instructors allowed it. Leadership dynamics were part of what they were evaluating, and dominant personalities always emerged in these environments. On day 9, Master Sergeant Kruger introduced partner-based training. Real-world operations require trust, he announced during morning formation. You need to know your teammates' capabilities and limitations. For the next week, you'll be working in assigned pairs. If your partner fails, you both fail. The pairings were posted outside the headquarters building. Reeves scanned the list and found her name next to Tor's. A fair match. He'd been one of the few candidates who treated her like an equal rather than an oddity. But as she turned to head to breakfast, Kruger's voice stopped her. Reeves, Matson, switch with Tors and Campbell. She turned back to find Matson grinning at her, his expression somewhere between amusement and predatory anticipation. Tors caught her eye and shook his head slightly, a silent apology for whatever was coming. The first partnered exercise was a 12-mile ruck march carrying 80-pound packs through the dense North Carolina pine forests. Matson set a punishing pace from the start, his longer stride forcing Reeves to work harder to keep up. He glanced back periodically, clearly expecting to see her struggling, but she matched his rhythm without complaint, her breathing controlled, her posture solid despite the weight. "You're tougher than you look," Matson said after the first hour, not quite managing to make it sound like a compliment. "Looks can be deceiving," Reeves replied evenly. After the ruck march came combatives training, hand-to-hand combat in the sandy pit behind the training facility. The instructors paired candidates by weight class, but Matson volunteered before they could assign him an opponent. "I'll go with Reeves," he announced, already moving to the center of the pit. "Show everyone what she's got." The other candidates formed a circle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to uncomfortable anticipation. This was the kind of moment that defined pecking orders, that established who belonged and who didn't. Tors stood at the edge, his jaw tight, knowing he couldn't intervene without making things worse. Kruger nodded to the combatives' instructor, a former Marine with cauliflower ears and hands like sledgehammers. "Ground rules. 3-minute rounds, tap out ends it, no strikes to the throat or groin. This is training, not a grudge match. Understood?" Both nodded. The whistle blew. Matson came forward aggressively, using his size advantage to pressure Reeves toward the edge of the pit. He shot for a takedown, his technique textbook perfect, the kind of move drilled into every special operations candidate until it became muscle memory. But Reeves had already shifted her weight, pivoting just enough that his momentum carried him past her. She didn't capitalize on the opening, instead resetting to neutral stance. They circled. Matson feinted high, then dove for her legs again. This time he connected, driving her backward into the sand. The weight difference was significant. He outweighed her by at least 60 pounds of muscle, and he used it, establishing a dominant position, controlling her movement. But Reeves didn't panic. She moved with the kind of economy that suggested formal training beyond the standard Army combatives curriculum. Her defensive posture was technically sound, her breathing calm despite being pinned. When Matson tried to transition to a submission hold, she created just enough space to prevent it, her limbs positioned exactly where they needed to be. "Come on, Reeves," Matson grunted, frustration creeping into his voice. "Fight back." She did, but only defensively. Every move she made was reactive, designed to prevent damage rather than inflict it. When opportunities appeared to reverse position or strike, she didn't take them. Instead, she studied him, his patterns, his breathing, the slight telegraph in his shoulders before he committed to a technique. The round ended with Matson in the superior position but without a submission. He stood, offering his hand. She took it, rising smoothly from the sand. "Good defense," he said, and this time he almost sounded genuine. "But in a real fight, defense doesn't win." "In a real fight," Reeves replied quietly, brushing sand from her uniform, "I wouldn't be pulling my strikes." Something flickered across Matson's face, uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint that he'd misjudged the situation. But it passed quickly, replaced by his familiar confidence. The platoon dispersed, their whispered conversations filled with analysis of what they'd just witnessed. Only Tors noticed what Reeves had actually done. She'd let Matson win while simultaneously cataloging every aspect of how he fought, his preferred techniques, his tells, his weaknesses. She'd turned a sparring match into an intelligence-gathering operation. That evening during chow, Matson held court at one of the long tables, recounting the day's events with embellishments that made him sound more dominant than the reality. "She's got heart. I'll give her that," he said, loud enough for Reeves to hear from across the dining facility. "But heart only gets you so far. This course is going to chew her up." Several candidates laughed, though a few, including Tors, remained silent. Reeves sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating her meal while reading a technical manual on Middle Eastern insurgent tactics. She appeared completely absorbed in the text, oblivious to the conversation happening 20 feet away. But she heard every word, filed it away with everything else she'd learned about Derek Matson. Back in the barracks that night, Matson updated his betting pool. "I'm giving her 2 more weeks, Max," he announced. "The academic phase is coming up, and let's be real, she's probably never even seen combat outside of a training exercise." The words hung in the air, confident and dismissive. Reeves, lying in her bunk with her back to the room, allowed herself the smallest smile. In 72 hours, the academic phase would begin, comprehensive examinations covering tactical planning, intelligence analysis, and regional expertise. She'd spent 18 months operating in Syria under deep cover, embedded with Kurdish fighters along the Turkish border, running intelligence operations that most of these candidates couldn't imagine. She'd memorized terrain maps, tribal dynamics, and insurgent supply routes while dodging airstrikes and navigating a civil war with more factions than most people could count. The written test would be interesting. Very interesting indeed. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the barracks fade into background noise. 2 more weeks, Matson had predicted. She'd let him keep thinking that, right up until the moment his entire world shifted. Patience, after all, was just another weapon in her arsenal. Week 3 arrived with an unexpected shift in tempo. The physical torture continued. Ruck marches through swamps, midnight obstacle courses, endless iterations of room-clearing drills. But Master Sergeant Kruger announced during Monday morning formation that the next 72 hours would focus on academics. "Physical capability is baseline," Kruger said, his voice cutting through the humid morning air. "But muscles without brains get people killed. Special operations require strategic thinking, cultural awareness, and the ability to analyze complex situations under pressure. Wednesday, 800 hours, you'll sit for a comprehensive examination covering tactical planning, intelligence analysis, counterterrorism operations, and regional expertise. Study materials are available in the Learning Center. Passing score is 85%. Anything less and you're out. A ripple of unease passed through the formation. Most of these men had been selected for their physical prowess and operational skills, not their academic abilities. The shooters, the door kickers, the ones who lived for action, they'd spent their careers perfecting the physical craft of warfare, not studying geopolitical theory. Derek Matson shifted uncomfortably. His academic record at the Naval Academy had been respectable but unremarkable. He excelled at leadership and tactics, but had always struggled with the theoretical side of military science. Maya Reeves, standing in her usual position in the middle of the formation, showed no reaction whatsoever. The next 2 days descended into chaos as candidates crammed information into their heads with the desperation of college students facing finals. The Learning Center, a converted conference room filled with field manuals, intelligence reports, and reference materials, became standing room only. Men who could deadlift 300 pounds hunched over notebooks, scribbling notes about the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam, the organizational structure of Hezbollah, the geography of the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. Tours found Reeves in the Learning Center Tuesday evening, long after most candidates had retreated to the barracks for last-minute cramming sessions. She sat alone at a corner table, a stack of classified intelligence summaries spread before her, reading with the focused intensity of someone searching for specific information rather than desperately trying to absorb everything. "You worried about tomorrow?" he asked, dropping into the chair across from her. She looked up, marking her place with a finger. "Should I be?" "Most people are." Tours gestured at the materials. "This isn't exactly standard training curriculum. Some of these scenarios are graduate-level strategic studies." "What are you reading?" Reeves asked, deflecting the question. Tours held up his notebook, filled with dense notes about Taliban command structures and opium trade routes through Central Asia, trying to understand the connections between terrorist financing and regional instability. "You." Reeves glanced down at the document before her, a declassified Defense Intelligence Agency assessment of Iranian proxy operations in Syria. "Just reviewing some familiar material." Something in her tone made Tours pause. "Familiar." She met his eyes for a long moment, then simply returned to reading. The conversation was over. Wednesday morning arrived cold and overcast. The candidates filed into a converted gymnasium where 30 desks had been arranged in neat rows, each separated by enough space to prevent cheating. Proctors, senior NCOs with notepads and stopwatches, positioned themselves around the room's perimeter. Kruger stood at the front holding a sealed envelope. "You have 4 hours. The examination consists of 100 questions, multiple choice, short answer, and essay responses. You may not use any reference materials. You may not communicate with other candidates. If you finish early, remain seated until everyone is complete. Begin." The sound of ripping paper echoed through the gym as candidates tore open their test booklets. Almost immediately, expressions of confusion and concern appeared on faces throughout the room. The questions weren't basic knowledge tests. They were scenario-based problems requiring deep analytical thinking and specialized expertise. Question 23. An intelligence asset reports that a high-value target is moving weapons through the Euphrates River Valley near Al-Mayadin, Syria. Identify 3 likely routes, explain the tribal dynamics that would affect interdiction operations, and outline the potential complications from Russian and Iranian forces operating in the region. Question 47. Analyze the tactical advantages and disadvantages of conducting a direct action raid versus a drone strike against a terrorist compound located in a densely populated area of Mosul, Iraq. Consider civilian casualties, intelligence gathering opportunities, and long-term strategic implications. Question 68. Describe the organizational structure and operational methodology of Kataib Hezbollah, including their relationship with Iranian Quds Force and their historical targeting patterns against U.S. forces. Matson stared at question 23 for a full 5 minutes, his jaw clenched. He knew the Euphrates River Valley existed, could probably find it on a map, but the specific geography, tribal dynamics, and military force positions. He made his best educated guess and moved on, feeling his confidence eroding with each page. Around the room, candidates hunched over their desks, some writing furiously, others staring at questions with the blank expression of someone utterly lost. Torres worked methodically, his special forces training providing enough background knowledge to construct reasonable answers, even if he wasn't certain about every detail. Maya Reeves completed page 1 in 12 minutes. She wrote with the fluid efficiency of someone transcribing information they already knew rather than struggling to recall half-remembered facts. Her answers weren't tentative or hedged. They were precise, specific, and filled with operational details that could only come from actual experience. For question 23, she didn't just identify the 3 most likely weapons routes through the Euphrates Valley. She named the specific villages along each route, identified the tribal sheiks who controlled the territory, noted the Russian helicopter base at T4 airfield that complicated airspace management, and explained how Iranian Revolutionary Guard positions near Al-Bukamal created a buffer zone that would require careful coordination to avoid international incidents. She finished the examination in 2 hours and 7 minutes. She reviewed her answers once, made 2 small corrections, then closed her booklet and sat quietly, hands folded on the desk, while the rest of the platoon continued to struggle. Kruger, observing from the front of the room, noted the finish time with raised eyebrows. Early completion could mean 2 things: complete mastery or total failure. He'd seen both. When the 4-hour mark arrived, several candidates were still frantically writing, trying to squeeze out a few more points. "Time," Kruger called. "Pencils down. Bring your examination booklets forward." The candidates filed past, depositing their tests on Kruger's desk with expressions ranging from cautious optimism to obvious defeat. Matson's face was carefully neutral, but Torres noticed the tension in his shoulders, the body language of someone who knew they hadn't performed well. That evening, while the platoon gathered in the barracks rehashing questions and comparing answers, Kruger sat alone in his office working through the examinations. He graded Matson's first, 71%, a failure. Torres, 88%, solid performance as expected from someone with his background. Then he opened Reeves's examination. Perfect score on the multiple choice. The short answers weren't just correct, they demonstrated nuanced understanding of complex subjects, but it was the essay responses that made Kruger lean back in his chair and reach for her personnel file. She hadn't just answered the questions about Syrian operations. She'd provided operational details that weren't in any of the study materials. She referenced specific terrain features using local Arabic names. She described insurgent supply routes with the precision of someone who'd physically mapped them. She discussed the behavioral patterns of various militant groups with insights that could only come from direct observation. Kruger opened her file again, staring at the redacted sections. Most personnel files contained detailed deployment histories, unit assignments, training records. Hers had a single entry, previous deployment, classified, duration, 18 months, theater, REDACTED, security clearance, TSSCI with additional compartmented access. He picked up his phone and dialed a number at Fort Meade. After 3 transfers and 2 authentication protocols, a woman's voice answered. "This is Kruger, 1st Special Operations Command. I need information on a major." He paused, looking at the file again. The rank said Staff Sergeant, but that notation in the margin. "Stand by." He hung up and reached for a different phone, this one with a secure line. When the call connected, he simply said, "Who the hell is Maya Reeves?" The answer he received made him very carefully close her examination booklet and lock it in his desk. Tomorrow's formation would be very interesting indeed. Thursday morning formation carried a different energy. The test results wouldn't be posted until the afternoon, but word had already spread through unofficial channels. The examination had been brutal, and multiple candidates were likely facing elimination. Men who'd been cocky just days earlier now stood with the subdued tension of soldiers waiting for casualty reports. Master Sergeant Kruger emerged from headquarters at precisely 800, a clipboard in hand and an expression that revealed nothing. "Listen up. Before we address test results, I'm announcing the next phase of training, escape and evasion. This is a 5-day field exercise designed to test your survival skills, tactical thinking, and stress tolerance under the most realistic conditions we can create short of actual combat." He gestured to a terrain map mounted on an easel behind him. "You'll be inserted in pairs at various points throughout the Owari National Forest. Your objective: reach this extraction point 60 miles north while evading a hunter force comprised of instructors and role players. You'll have minimal equipment, a compass, basic survival gear, and 1 MRE per person. The hunter force will have vehicles, communications, night vision, and full knowledge of the terrain." A hand went up. "What happens if we're caught?" "Interrogation resistance training," Kruger replied flatly. "You'll be processed through a mock detention facility where you'll experience stress positions, sleep deprivation, and psychological pressure designed to test your resistance to exploitation. After processing, you'll be released back into the field to continue the exercise. Questions?" Silence. "Pairings are posted. You have 2 hours to prepare. Insertion begins at 1100 hours." The platoon surged toward the bulletin board. Derek Matson scanned the list, his stomach sinking as he found his name. Matson/Reeves, insertion point Delta. He turned to find Reeves standing nearby, her expression neutral as always. "Looks like we're teammates," he said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. "Looks like it," she agreed. Torres caught Matson's eye from across the crowd and gave him a look that said good luck, though whether it was sympathy for being paired with Reeves or a warning about underestimating her, Matson couldn't tell. 2 hours later, they sat in the back of a truck with blacked-out windows, wearing blindfolds to prevent them from identifying their insertion point. The ride lasted 40 minutes over progressively rougher roads until the vehicle finally stopped and the tailgate dropped. "Out," the driver commanded, "briefing in 30 seconds." They stumbled out into dense forest, removing their blindfolds to find themselves in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. An instructor handed them each a compass, a basic survival kit, and 1 MRE. "The extraction point is 60 miles due north. You have 5 days. The hunter force is already deployed and will be actively searching. Avoid capture, reach the objective. Go." Matson immediately pulled out his compass, orienting himself to magnetic north. "Okay, we head straight north, move fast, put distance between us and—" "Wait," Reeves interrupted quietly. She was studying the forest around them, her eyes tracking the sun's position through the canopy. "This insertion point is deliberately exposed. If we move straight north on an obvious bearing, we'll walk into checkpoint after checkpoint." "Then what do you suggest?" Matson asked, frustration already creeping into his voice. Reeves knelt, using a stick to sketch a rough map in the dirt. "The terrain here is part of the Owari Ridge system. Valleys run northeast-southwest. If we follow the ridgeline northwest for the first day, we'll be moving through difficult terrain that limits vehicle access. It adds miles, but it reduces our chance of early capture." Matson stared at the sketch. How do you know the terrain patterns? I studied the topographical maps in the learning center, she replied, while everyone else was cramming tactical theory. He wanted to argue to assert his leadership, but something in the certainty of her voice made him pause. Fine, we try it your way for today, but if we get caught because we're moving slow through rough terrain. We won't, she said simply, already moving toward the ridgeline. The first day was grueling. Reeves led them along a narrow ridge covered in dense underbrush and fallen timber, terrain that would have been nearly impossible to navigate at night, but provided excellent concealment during daylight. They moved slowly, deliberately, stopping frequently to listen for signs of the hunter force. Just after sunset, they heard engines in the valley below, vehicles moving along a dirt road, exactly where they would have been if they'd followed Matson's original plan. He didn't say anything, but Reeves noticed the way his jaw tightened. They made camp in a small depression surrounded by mountain laurel, eating their MREs cold to avoid creating heat signatures. Matson took first watch while Reeves slept, or appeared to. He suspected she was only resting, her senses still attuned to the environment. The second day brought them down into a valley where a shallow creek provided both water and a natural navigation route. They were making good time, covering nearly 15 miles, when Reeves suddenly froze. Down, she whispered, dropping into the creek bed. Matson followed instantly, his training overriding his questions. 30 seconds later, 2 role players dressed in civilian clothes appeared on the ridgeline above them, scanning the valley with binoculars. The hunter force was using spotters in elevated positions, a tactic Matson hadn't anticipated but Reeves apparently had. They waited motionless in the frigid water for 20 minutes until the spotters moved on. How did you know? Matson asked as they continued north. The terrain naturally funnels movement through this valley, Reeves explained. It's what I would do, position observers at high points overlooking choke points. You think like them, Matson observed. I think like someone who's done this before, she corrected. On the afternoon of the third day, their luck ran out. They were crossing a logging road, unavoidable given the terrain, when a truck appeared around a bend. The hunter force deployed immediately, 6 role players spreading out in a textbook blocking formation. Run or surrender? Matson asked, already knowing the answer. Surrender, Reeves said. We fight, we get injured. We run, they track us down. Better to get interrogation over with and get back in the field. They raised their hands as the hunter force advanced, weapons raised, shouting commands. Within minutes, they were hooded, flex-cuffed, and loaded into a truck. The mock detention facility was a converted warehouse designed to replicate the conditions of a hostile interrogation environment. Matson and Reeves were separated immediately, processed through a humiliating intake procedure, stripped, searched, photographed, then placed in separate isolation cells. The interrogations began 2 hours later. Matson was subjected to stress positions, bright lights, and aggressive questioning delivered by role players who were disturbingly good at creating psychological pressure. They hammered him with questions about his mission, his unit, his training, mixing truth with fiction to disorient him. After 3 hours, exhausted and desperate for it to end, he provided information slightly beyond the Big Five. Name, rank, service number, date of birth, blood type, giving up details about his training timeline that technically violated resistance protocols. When they released him back into the field at midnight, he felt both relieved and ashamed. Reeves's interrogation followed a different pattern. The role players recognized within the first hour that standard techniques weren't working. She maintained absolute composure through stress positions that should have been agonizing. She answered questions with perfectly calibrated responses, giving the Big Five when required, deflecting everything else with polite non-answers that provided zero intelligence value. The senior interrogator, a retired Special Forces soldier who'd conducted real interrogations in Iraq and Afghanistan, tried advanced psychological manipulation. He claimed her partner had already talked, that resistance was pointless, that cooperation would end her discomfort. Reeves smiled slightly. "Sir, with respect, that approach is in Chapter 4 of the Army's Interrogation Resistance Manual. I know you're doing your job, but I'm going to continue doing mine." The interrogator broke character for just a moment, impressed despite himself. "Where did you learn counterinterrogation techniques this advanced?" "I'm afraid that's classified," she replied pleasantly. They kept her for 6 hours, longer than any other candidate had endured, before finally releasing her back into the field at 400. She found Matson waiting at the designated rally point, huddled against a tree, looking exhausted and defeated. When he saw her approach, something in his expression changed, respect mixing with curiosity and the first real hint of humility. "They kept you a long time," he said quietly. "They were thorough," she acknowledged. "Did you," he hesitated, "did you give them anything?" "No." The single word carried absolute certainty. Matson stood, shouldering his minimal gear. "Okay, what's our route for the next 2 days?" For the first time since they'd been paired together, he was genuinely asking rather than asserting. Reeves pulled out her compass, orienting to their position. "There's a river system 10 miles northeast. We follow it north, moving at night, hiding during the day. We'll reach extraction with 12 hours to spare." "Lead the way," Matson said. And for the first time, he genuinely meant it. The 4th day of the escape and evasion exercise dawned cold and misty, the kind of gray morning that made visibility poor and movement dangerous. Maya Reeves and Derek Matson had covered another 12 miles during the night, following the river system exactly as she'd planned. They now rested in a dense thicket of rhododendron, invisible from more than 10 feet away, eating the last of their meager rations. Matson had been quiet since their release from the detention facility, his usual bravado replaced by thoughtful observation. He watched Reeves navigate with the confidence of someone who'd done this countless times, nodding the way she read terrain, anticipated danger, and made decisions with zero hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, keeping his voice low. Reeves looked up from the map she'd sketched in the dirt with a stick. "Go ahead." "Who are you really?" She studied him for a long moment, then returned to her map. "Does it matter?" "Yeah," Matson said, surprising himself with his honesty. "I've spent 2 weeks treating you like you don't belong here, but you navigate like a Green Beret, resist interrogation like someone who's been captured before, and handle stress like it's just another Tuesday. So yeah, it matters, because I've been an asshole to someone who clearly knows what she's doing." Before Reeves could respond, the sharp crack of a branch snapping froze them both. She held up a fist, the universal signal for freeze, and tilted her head, listening. Voices carried through the mist, maybe 200 yards downstream. Then the unmistakable sound of someone in distress. "Help, somebody help." Matson recognized the voice, Campbell, one of the recon Marines, paired with a SEAL named Rodriguez. They'd been captured on day 2 and apparently caught again. "We keep moving," Matson whispered. "That's the smart play. We're less than 20 miles from extraction." But Reeves was already moving, low and fast, toward the voices. Matson cursed under his breath and followed. They crept to the edge of a small clearing where the river bent sharply. Campbell and Rodriguez were pinned down behind a fallen log, surrounded by 6 Hunter Force members who'd positioned themselves in a textbook L-shaped ambush. The 2 candidates were out of options. Any attempt to run would result in immediate casualties from the simulation rounds. Reeves dropped flat beside Matson, her eyes scanning the tactical situation with the rapid assessment of a trained operator. 3 on the left flank, 3 holding the center. They're focused entirely on the trapped candidates. No rear security. "It's not our problem," Matson insisted, even as he realized he didn't believe his own words anymore. Two candidates pinned down by superior force, Reeves said quietly. In real combat, would you leave them? This isn't real combat. No, she agreed, but it tells you what kind of operator someone is, the kind who leaves people behind or the kind who doesn't. Before Matson could argue further, she was moving again, circling wide through the forest with movements so fluid and silent she seemed to disappear into the terrain. Matson followed, his respect growing with every step. Reeves positioned them on the high ground behind the hunter force's left flank, using hand signals to communicate her plan. She'd break left, draw their attention, create confusion. Matson would flank right, engage the center element. Rodriguez and Campbell would use the chaos to break contact. It was aggressive, risky, and completely against the exercise's stated objective of avoiding contact. It was also tactically sound. Matson nodded his agreement, and Reeves moved. What happened next would be dissected in the after-action review for weeks. Reeves emerged from the tree line with precision timing, her simulation weapon engaging the left flank with controlled pairs, double taps that eliminated two role players before they even registered the threat. She moved with the flowing efficiency of someone who'd executed close-quarters battle countless times, her footwork perfect, her weapon transition seamless. The remaining Hunter Force members pivoted to engage this new threat, exactly as she'd anticipated. Matson used their distraction to roll into position, engaging the center element from an unexpected angle. His shots were good, SEAL training showing through, but it was Reeves who controlled the engagement. She communicated with Campbell and Rodriguez using hand signals they'd never practiced together, yet somehow they understood immediately. She directed their movement, covered their withdrawal, and executed a tactical retreat that would have made a special operations instructor proud. Within 90 seconds, all four candidates had broken contact and disappeared into the forest, leaving the bewildered Hunter Force wondering what the hell had just happened. They regrouped half a mile north, running hard through the underbrush. Campbell, gasping for breath, stared at Reeves like he'd seen a ghost. "Who taught you to move like that?" "Keep moving," Reeves commanded, her tone carrying authority that made everyone comply without question. "They'll have quick reaction force helicopters in the air within minutes. We need to put distance between us and the contact point." She led them through a complex evasion route, doubling back, moving through water to break their scent trail, using terrain to mask their signatures. Rodriguez, a veteran SEAL with 3 deployments, followed her lead without hesitation, recognizing expertise when he saw it. 2 hours later, safely hidden in a cave system Reeves had somehow known existed, the 4 of them finally stopped to catch their breath. "That wasn't random," Campbell said, still staring at Reeves. "The way you moved, the way you controlled that engagement, that was real-world operational experience." "We should rest," Reeves deflected. "We still have 16 miles to extraction." But Matson wasn't letting it go anymore. "Campbell's right. I've trained with SEALs, Force Recon, Delta operators. You move like someone who's been doing this for years in actual combat. Not exercises, not training, the real thing." Reeves met his eyes, and for the first time, Matson saw something shift in her expression. A decision being made about whether to maintain the facade or acknowledge the truth. "Afghanistan or Iraq?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "Neither," Reeves replied. "Then where?" She was silent for a long moment then. "Syria. 18 months embedded with Kurdish forces along the Turkish border. Intelligence collection and direct action against ISIS high-value targets." The cave went absolutely silent. "Bullshit," Campbell whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Women weren't allowed in." "Women weren't allowed in a lot of things until they were," Reeves interrupted. "And some of us were doing those things long before the policies officially changed. Special Activities Center doesn't advertise its personnel composition. Matson felt his entire worldview shifting. Special Activities Center, you're CIA. I'm a soldier, Reeves corrected. On loan to a classified unit for a classified mission that I successfully completed 3 months ago. This training cycle is my post-deployment assignment before I rotate back. Why are you here? Rodriguez asked. If you've already done the real thing, why subject yourself to this? Because I was asked to evaluate the training pipeline from the inside, she said simply. To identify gaps, assess instruction quality, and see how candidates handle stress and ambiguity. The Army is considering women for more special operations roles. They wanted data from someone who'd actually operated at that level. Campbell laughed, a short, bitter sound. So we've been hazing a decorated combat veteran for 2 weeks while she was grading our performance. Not hazing, Matson said quietly, shame flooding through him. I was hazing her. You guys were just following my lead. He looked at Reeves. I'm sorry, I assumed you were. I don't even know what I assumed. That you were here to prove a point or fill a quota. I never considered that you might actually be more qualified than any of us. Assumptions, Reeves said, are what get people killed downrange. You assume the person who looks least dangerous isn't a threat. You assume the quiet one doesn't have anything to contribute. You assume that because someone doesn't advertise their capabilities, they don't have them. She stood, shouldering her minimal gear. Those assumptions almost got Campbell and Rodriguez captured for a second time. In real combat, they might have been killed. The weight of her words settled over them. What's your call sign? Rodriguez asked suddenly. Reeves paused at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the gray daylight. The Kurdish fighters I worked with gave me one. Desert Serpent. Something about being the threat you don't see until it's too late. She stepped out into the forest, and after a moment's hesitation, the 3 men followed. They reached the extraction point 8 hours early, the first team to successfully complete the exercise. As the helicopter descended to retrieve them, Matson stood beside Reeves, watching the rotor wash flatten the grass. For what it's worth, he said over the noise, you're the best operator I've ever trained with. Reeves glanced at him, and for the first time since they'd met, she smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. You're not bad yourself, Matson. You just needed to learn when to follow instead of lead. The helicopter touched down, and they climbed aboard for the flight back to Fort Bragg, where the real revelation was still waiting. The return to Fort Bragg felt different. Word had spread through unofficial channels about the dramatic rescue during the escape and evasion exercise, but the details remained murky. 4 candidates returning 8 hours early, all successfully evading capture after a tactical engagement with the Hunter force. It was unprecedented in the course's history. Master Sergeant Kruger met them at the landing zone, his expression unreadable as they climbed out of the helicopter. Debrief in 30 minutes, he said curtly. Get cleaned up, get food, then report to the conference room. The barracks erupted when they entered. Jackson Torres was the first to approach, clasping Matson's hand. We heard you guys made contact with the Hunter force. That true? Yeah, Matson said. But instead of launching into a story with himself at the center, he simply nodded toward Reeves. She pulled off something I've never seen in training before. The room went quiet. Several candidates exchanged glances, sensing something had shifted but not understanding what. Reeves headed straight for the showers, ignoring the attention. Rodriguez and Campbell, however, weren't as circumspect. Within 15 minutes, fragments of the story had circulated through the platoon, a perfectly executed tactical rescue, movements that suggested professional-level experience, and cryptic comments about Syria and classified operations. The conference room debrief included Kruger, 2 senior instructors, and a lieutenant colonel from the Special Operations Command headquarters whom no one had seen before. The officer wore a chest full of ribbons, including a silver star and 3 bronze stars with V devices for valor. Tell me exactly what happened, Kruger commanded, his tone suggesting this was more than routine after-action review. Matson started to speak, but Reeves cut him off. I made a tactical decision to deviate from the exercise objectives in order to assist trapped teammates. The responsibility is mine. The question wasn't about responsibility, the lieutenant colonel said, his voice measured. It was about what happened. Walk me through the engagement. For the next 20 minutes, they reconstructed the incident. Rodriguez and Campbell described being trapped. Matson explained Reeves's tactical plan. Reeves herself provided a clinical breakdown of the assault, fields of fire, timing, communication, and the decision matrix that led to engagement rather than evasion. The lieutenant colonel took notes, occasionally asking pointed questions that suggested he had extensive tactical experience himself. When the debrief concluded, he dismissed everyone except Reeves and Kruger. "Wait outside," Kruger told the three men. They stood in the hallway for 40 minutes, the silence heavy with speculation. Finally, the door opened, and the lieutenant colonel emerged, pausing to look at Matson, Rodriguez, and Campbell. "What you witnessed today stays quiet until I say otherwise," he said. "Understood?" "Yes, sir," they replied in unison. He left without further explanation. Kruger appeared in the doorway, his expression complicated. "Get the platoon assembled in the classroom. Formation in 10 minutes, full uniform." The platoon gathered with the nervous energy of soldiers who sensed something significant was about to happen. Some candidates had already been eliminated based on the academic testing. The final count stood at 23 instead of the original 30. Those who remained were the most resilient, the most capable, the ones who'd survived every filter the course had thrown at them. Kruger entered with the lieutenant colonel, and everyone snapped to attention. "Seats," Kruger commanded. The lieutenant colonel moved to the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Gentlemen, this training cycle has been unique for several reasons, one of which I'm about to explain." He paused, letting the tension build. Special operations require not just physical capability and tactical proficiency, but also strategic thinking, cultural awareness, and the ability to operate in ambiguous environments where the rules aren't clear and the stakes are life and death. He gestured to Reeves, who sat in her usual middle-row position, her expression neutral. "What you don't know is that this cycle included an evaluation component beyond your own assessment. We embedded an experienced operator among you to test 3 things: how you treat teammates you perceive as weaker, how you handle incomplete information, and whether you can recognize excellence when it doesn't advertise itself." The room was absolutely silent. "Staff Sergeant Maya Reeves," the colonel continued, "is actually Major Maya Reeves, a decorated Special Operations officer currently assigned to a classified unit within the Special Activities Center. She volunteered for this assignment at our request." The shock was visible. Jaws dropped, eyes widened, and several candidates turned to stare at Reeves with expressions ranging from disbelief to embarrassment. "For the 18 months prior to this training cycle," the colonel continued, "Major Reeves operated deep cover in northern Syria, embedded with Kurdish Peshmerga forces fighting ISIS. Her mission required her to live among local fighters, gather intelligence on high-value targets, and coordinate direct action operations in one of the most complex combat environments in the world." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it. During her deployment, Major Reeves successfully identified and facilitated the elimination of 3 Tier 1 ISIS commanders. She prevented a planned chemical weapons attack on a refugee camp housing 14,000 civilians, and she extracted an intelligence asset from a hostile area under fire, despite being wounded herself. Torres sat forward, his eyes locked on Reeves, who remained perfectly still. "The Kurdish and Syrian Democratic Forces fighters she served alongside gave her a call sign," the colonel said. "Desert Serpent, a predator that strikes from where you least expect it, invisible until the moment of attack, always watching, always calculating, always 3 steps ahead of the enemy. Matson felt his stomach drop, remembering every dismissive comment, every condescending interaction, every assumption he'd made about her capabilities. Major Reeves wasn't here to compete, the colonel explained. She was here to evaluate how candidates respond to diversity in their ranks, how they treat teammates based on perception rather than performance, and whether they have the humility to recognize expertise in unexpected packages. He closed the folder. Her assessment will inform policy decisions about integration of women into additional special operations roles. But more immediately, her observations about each of you will factor into your final evaluations and potential selection for advanced training. The implications hit like a freight train. The person they dismissed, hazed, and underestimated had been evaluating them the entire time. Every interaction, every comment, every moment of casual disrespect had been observed and documented. "Major Reeves," the colonel said, "do you have anything you'd like to share with the platoon?" She stood slowly, moving to the front of the room. For a long moment she simply looked at the faces staring back at her, some ashamed, some awed, some angry at having been deceived. "I wasn't trying to trick you," she began, her voice calm and clear. "I was trying to see who you really are, because in combat you can't hide. Your true character emerges under stress, in how you treat people you think can't help you, in how you respond when things don't match your expectations." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "Some of you treated me with respect from day one. Tors, Campbell, a few others. You judged me on performance rather than appearance. That says something about your character and your potential as leaders." Her eyes found Matson. Others needed to learn humility, to understand that the most dangerous operators aren't always the loudest or the most obvious. In real combat, ego kills. Assumptions kill. The inability to adapt your thinking when presented with new information kills. Matson held her gaze, accepting the rebuke he deserved. "The call sign Desert Serpent wasn't something I chose," Reeves continued. "It was given to me by fighters who'd spent their entire lives at war, who'd seen every kind of operator from every military in the world. They chose it because I succeeded by being underestimated, by appearing unremarkable, by striking when and where the enemy didn't expect." She walked slowly along the front row. "That's the lesson I hope you take from this. The best operators aren't always the ones who look the part. Sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes they're patient. Sometimes they're the person you dismissed without a second thought. Your job as future special operations leaders is to recognize talent wherever it exists and leverage it, not assume you already know who has value and who doesn't." The room remained silent, absorbing her words. "Thank you for the opportunity to work with you," she concluded, "even when some of you were being assholes." A few nervous laughs broke the tension. Kruger stepped forward. "Major Reeves will remain with us through graduation to complete her evaluation. I expect professional conduct from this point forward." Dismissed. Atmosphere in the barracks that evening was unlike anything the platoon had experienced. The usual bravado and competitive banter had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable silence as candidates processed the revelation about Maya Reeves. Men who'd spent weeks proving their toughness now grappled with the reality that they'd been judged and found wanting by someone far more experienced than themselves. Derek Matson sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. The memory of every dismissive comment, every condescending look, every moment he'd treated Reeves like she didn't belong played on repeat in his mind. He'd built his identity around being the alpha, the leader, the best operator in any room. Now he realized he'd spent 3 weeks being evaluated by someone operating on a completely different level. Around 2100 hours, he stood and walked to where Reeves sat reading, the same Arabic novel she'd had since day one, which now took on new significance. The book wasn't for show, it was maintenance, keeping language skills sharp for her next deployment. "Major Reeves," he began formally, Can I have a word? She looked up, marking her page. You can call me Maya. The rank reveal was for official purposes. I'd prefer to use your rank, Matson said, because I need to apologize properly, and I need you to understand I take this seriously. Reeves gestured to the empty bunk across from her. Matson sat, aware that several other candidates were watching from across the bay. I was an asshole to you, he said bluntly. From day one, I made assumptions based on nothing but my own prejudice and ego. I treated you like you were taking up space that belonged to someone more deserving, when the truth is you were more qualified than anyone in this entire platoon, including me, especially me. He met her eyes. I'm sorry, not just for the disrespect but for what it represents. I claim to be a professional, but I let bias override judgment. In combat, that kind of thinking gets people killed. You tried to show me that during the E&E exercise, and I was too stubborn to see it clearly until now. Reeves studied him for a long moment. Why do you think you reacted that way? The question caught him off guard. I don't know. Maybe because I've always been the best, and seeing someone different made me feel threatened. Threatened by what? She pressed. Matson thought about it, really thought about it. Threatened by the possibility that everything I believed about what makes a good operator might be wrong. That maybe physical dominance and aggression aren't the only things that matter. That I might have blind spots I never acknowledged. And now, Reeves asked. Now I know I have blind spots, Matson admitted, and I need to fix that before it gets someone killed. Reeves closed her book. Derek, you're a solid operator. Your tactical skills are excellent, your physical capabilities are top tier, and when you finally let go of your ego during the E&E exercise, you showed good judgment and leadership. The problem wasn't your ability, it was your assumption that ability only looks one way. She leaned forward slightly. The apology is accepted, but more importantly, I need you to understand what this means going forward. You're going to deploy with people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who come from different backgrounds and bring different capabilities. Your job as a leader isn't to make them fit your mold, it's to recognize their strengths and employ them effectively. I understand that now, Matson said quietly. Watching you work during that rescue, I've never seen anyone move like that outside of Tier 1 units. You made it look effortless. It wasn't effortless, Reeves corrected. It was the result of thousands of hours of training and 18 months of daily combat where mistakes meant death. The difference is I don't need to advertise it. The work speaks for itself. Jackson Torres approached, having listened from nearby. Major, can I ask you something? Go ahead, Jax. Why didn't you just tell us from the beginning? Why go through weeks of being disrespected when you could have shut it down immediately? Reeves smiled slightly. Because real intelligence doesn't come from how people act when they know they're being watched. It comes from observing them when they think no one important is paying attention. How you treat people you perceive as weaker or less valuable reveals your true character. She stood, addressing not just Torres and Matson but the growing circle of candidates who'd gathered around. In Syria, I worked with fighters from a dozen different backgrounds. Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Yazidis, people who'd spent generations hating each other but had to work together to survive. You know what I learned? The best teams aren't built on similarity. They're built on respect and the ability to recognize that different doesn't mean lesser. Campbell, the recon Marine from the E&E exercise, spoke up. What was it really like over there, if you can talk about it? Reeves was quiet for a moment, her expression distant. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, not because of the combat, though there was plenty of that, but because of the constant uncertainty. I couldn't call for backup, couldn't rely on American air support or quick reaction forces. I had to earn trust every single day from people who had no reason to trust Americans, who'd been betrayed by outside forces countless times. How did you earn it? Rodriguez asked. By being competent, reliable, and humble, she replied. By listening more than I talked, by learning their language and culture instead of expecting them to adapt to mine, by proving that I was there to help them achieve their objectives, not to impose my own agenda. She looked around the circle. The call sign Desert Serpent wasn't meant to be flattering at first. Snakes aren't trusted in that culture, but over time it evolved. They saw me as someone who could strike decisively when needed but mostly stayed hidden, watching, waiting, gathering information. Someone who didn't need to be the center of attention but who always came through when it mattered. Matson absorbed this, feeling the weight of lessons he should have learned years ago. "Will you tell us about the mission, the one the colonel mentioned?" Reeves hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Some of it. There was an ISIS cell planning to deploy chemical weapons, chlorine gas, in a refugee camp near the Turkish border. We got intelligence about the plot but couldn't verify the location or timing. I spent 6 weeks embedded in a town near the suspected target area, gathering information, building a network of local sources." The barracks had gone completely silent, every candidate hanging on her words. The intelligence picture came together piece by piece. I identified the cell leader, tracked his movements, located the weapons cache. But we couldn't just call in an airstrike. The weapons were stored in a residential area with dozens of civilians nearby. We needed a ground operation. "Did you lead it?" Torres asked. "I coordinated it," Reeves corrected. "Led a team of Kurdish fighters who knew the terrain and the enemy better than I ever could. My job was to integrate intelligence with tactical execution, to make sure we hit the right target at the right time with minimal collateral damage." "And the wound?" Campbell prompted, remembering the colonel's mention. "We were extracting after destroying the cache," Reeves said matter-of-factly. "ISIS fighters who'd been watching the location launched a counterattack. I took shrapnel from an RPG that hit near our vehicle. Nothing serious. I was back on mission within 2 weeks." She said it so casually, like getting hit by rocket-propelled grenade fragments was a minor inconvenience. "The citation for that action is classified," she continued. "But the important part isn't the award. It's that 14,000 refugees, men, women, children, didn't die choking on chlorine gas because a team worked together effectively despite coming from completely different worlds." The silence that followed was reverent. Finally, a candidate named Peterson, a quiet ranger who'd barely spoken throughout the course, asked, "What advice would you give us for when we deploy?" Reeves considered the question carefully. "Remember that your mission is bigger than your ego. Take care of your people, especially the ones who are different from you, because diversity in skills and perspectives makes teams stronger. Stay humble. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you become dangerous to yourself and others. And never, ever assume you're the smartest person in the room." She looked directly at Matson. "Because sometimes the most dangerous operator is the quiet one you dismissed without a second thought." Matson nodded, accepting the lesson he'd earned the hard way. Over the next hour, the conversation evolved from confession to education. Reeves answered questions about counterinsurgency operations, cultural navigation in hostile environments, and the reality of modern warfare in places most Americans would never see. She spoke with the authority of experience but without ego, treating even basic questions with respect. As the barracks finally settled toward lights out, Matson found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about leadership, capability, and what it meant to be a special operator. The Desert Serpent had taught him more in 3 weeks than he'd learned in years of training. And the most important lesson was the simplest: never underestimate anyone. Graduation day arrived with clear skies and the crisp morning air that marked early autumn at Fort Bragg. The platoon, now reduced to 19 candidates who'd survived every filter the course had thrown at them, assembled in dress uniforms for the final formation. They stood different than they had 8 weeks earlier, carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of men who'd been tested and transformed. Master Sergeant Kruger stood before them, his weathered face showing something that might have been pride. You started as 30 of the military's best operators. You finish as 19 who prove they have what it takes for the next level. The training you completed here is just the beginning. Some of you will go on to Delta Selection, others to DEVGRU, Special Activities Center, or specialized units you've never heard of. Wherever you go, remember what you learned here. The lieutenant colonel who'd revealed Reeves's true identity stepped forward, carrying a stack of certificates and assignment orders. Each of you will receive your next duty station and recommendations for advanced training. But before we proceed with individual recognitions, Major Reeves has requested to address the platoon one final time. Reeves moved to the front, wearing her full dress uniform for the first time. The ribbons on her chest told a story the candidates hadn't seen before: Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Joint Service Commendation Medal, Combat Action Badge, and several classified campaign medals that couldn't be fully displayed. On her right shoulder was a patch most of them didn't recognize: the Special Activities Center insignia. 8 weeks ago, she began, I stood in that formation as someone you thought you knew, someone unremarkable, someone who didn't quite fit, and many of you treated me accordingly, some with respect, others with dismissal, a few with outright hostility. She paused, letting her gaze move across the formation. I'm not here to shame anyone for their initial reactions. Human beings make snap judgments based on pattern recognition and experience. It's a survival mechanism. The problem comes when you refuse to update those judgments when presented with contradictory evidence. Matson stood at attention, listening with the focus he wished he'd shown from day one. The purpose of this evaluation wasn't to catch you being wrong, Reeves continued. It was to see how quickly you adapted when reality didn't match your expectations. Some of you, Torres, Campbell, Rodriguez, Peterson, treated everyone with baseline professional respect regardless of your assumptions. That's leadership. That's the foundation of effective teams. She shifted her attention. Others needed time to see past their biases. Matson, you started as the biggest problem I documented, but you also showed the most growth. When confronted with evidence that contradicted your worldview, you adjusted. You apologized genuinely. You asked questions. You learned. That capacity for growth matters more than being right from the start. Matson felt both shame and gratitude in equal measure. The military is changing, Reeves said. Not because of politics or social pressure, but because warfare itself has changed. Modern conflicts require cultural understanding, language skills, the ability to build relationships with local populations, and operators who can blend into environments where traditional military bearing stands out. That means diverse teams with varied capabilities. She pulled a document from her pocket. My final evaluation report makes several recommendations. First, this training pipeline needs better cultural preparation, teaching operators to check their assumptions and recognize talent regardless of how it's packaged. Second, assessment criteria should be expanded beyond physical performance to include adaptability, cultural intelligence, and collaborative skills. Third, leadership evaluation should include how candidates treat people they perceive as weaker or different. The colonel nodded, clearly having already read her recommendations. But my most important recommendation, Reeves concluded, is about the candidates standing before me. Every one of you who graduated this course has the technical skills and mental toughness for special operations. Whether you have the wisdom and character for leadership positions will depend on what you do with the lessons you learned here. She stepped back. Congratulations on completing the course. I'm honored to have served alongside you. The ceremony proceeded with individual recognitions. Torres received orders for Delta Selection. Campbell was heading to Marine Special Operations Command for advanced training. Rodriguez was returning to SEAL Team 3 with a recommendation for instructor duty. When Matson's name was called, the colonel handed him his orders and added quietly, Major Reeves specifically recommended you for a leadership development program. She noted that despite a rough start, You demonstrated exceptional capacity for growth and self-awareness. Don't waste that potential." Matson looked across the formation to where Reeves stood and nodded his thanks. She returned the gesture with a slight smile. 3 months later, Derek Matson stood in a briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command, reviewing candidates for an upcoming SEAL training cycle. His eyes stopped on a folder. Female candidate, former Army intelligence analyst, strong academics but unremarkable physical scores. His first instinct was skepticism. Then he remembered a morning at Fort Bragg, watching someone he dismissed prove to be the most capable operator he'd ever trained with. He opened the folder and read deeper. The candidate spoke Arabic and Pashto, had spent 18 months in Afghanistan building relationships with female tribal leaders in areas male operators couldn't access, and had been credited with intelligence that prevented 3 major attacks on coalition forces. "What do you think?" his commander asked, nodding Matson's attention. "I think we should give her a shot," Matson said. "We need to evaluate performance, not assumptions." "Sounds like someone taught you something about that," the commander observed with a knowing look. "Yeah," Matson agreed. "The best operator I've ever worked with." Jackson Torres, deep into Delta Force selection in the mountains of West Virginia, found himself paired with a female candidate facing constant dismissal from other candidates. He remembered watching Reeves endure the same treatment and made a decision. "You're getting hazed because they're threatened," he told her during a rest break. "Prove them wrong by being excellent. I've got your back." She looked at him with surprise and gratitude. "Why help me?" "Because someone once showed me what right looks like," Torres replied. "And I'm not going to let ego and bias infect another team if I can help it." At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, Maya Reeves sat in a conference room reviewing deployment options for her next assignment. The Special Activities Center chief placed a folder before her. "Yemen," he said, "embedded with local forces targeting AQAP leadership. 18-month rotation, deep cover, high risk, maximum impact." Reeves opened the folder, scanning the intelligence summary. It was exactly the kind of mission she was built for: invisible, patient, lethal when necessary. "When do I leave?" she asked. 6 weeks. But before you go, I wanted you to know we received the final results from your Fort Bragg evaluation." He slid another document across the table, her official assessment of the training pipeline, complete with statistics, observations, and recommendations. "Your recommendations are being implemented across multiple special operations training courses. We're overhauling assessment criteria, adding cultural competency requirements, and training instructors to recognize diverse forms of excellence." He paused. "You also flagged 3 candidates for accelerated leadership development. All 3 are already exceeding expectations in their new assignments." Reeves thought of Matson, Torres, and Campbell, 3 men who'd learned to see past their assumptions. "One more thing," the chief said, pulling out a final document. "We had a request from Fort Bragg. Master Sergeant Kruger wants you to come back before deployment, guest instructor for 1 week, talking to the new class about operational realities." A month later, Reeves stood before a fresh platoon of special operations candidates on their first day of training. They looked at her with the usual mix of curiosity and skepticism, a female officer lecturing elite operators about combat. She smiled slightly. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. "My name is Major Maya Reeves," she began. "My call sign is Desert Serpent. And before any of you make assumptions about what I can or cannot do, let me tell you about a time in northern Syria when 14,000 people lived because a team looked past their prejudices and worked together." As she spoke, one candidate in the middle of the formation, a cocky young ranger who'd been whispering dismissive comments to his neighbor, gradually went quiet, leaning forward to listen. Kruger, watching from the back of the room, smiled. The cycle was beginning again, and this time the lesson would start on day one. Somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, in a compound that didn't appear on any official maps, an intelligence officer reviewed field reports from an asset embedded with local forces. The asset's call sign was listed simply as Desert Serpent. The most recent report detailed a high-value target identified, tracked, and eliminated with zero collateral damage. The operation had been flawless, patient, precise, and executed by someone who understood that the best operators are often the ones nobody sees coming. At the bottom of the report, someone had added a handwritten note. "She's the standard we should all meet." Maya Reeves, operating once again in the shadows where she worked best, continued her mission. Not for recognition or glory, but because the work mattered. Because protecting people mattered. Because somewhere back in the United States, a new generation of special operators was learning that excellence comes in many forms, and the most dangerous warriors often hide in plain sight. The Desert Serpent had struck again, and the enemy never saw her coming. The end.